Hi, I'm Elizabeth Ortiz from U.S. European Command Public Affairs in Stuttgart, Germany. And for the next hour, I'll moderate a virtual discussion with 8 American, British, and French historians about the multinational, multi-domain nature of the historic World War II operation known as D-Day, which occurred on June 6, 1944, 76 years ago today. Every year, hundreds of U.S. service members travel to the Normandy region of France to commemorate D-Day. Due to COVID-19, most events and ceremonies were canceled this year. However, we continue the D-Day tradition virtually in honor of all the Allied forces who stood defiant against Nazi tyranny on land, at sea, and in the air. With that, I'd like to start us off by introducing Bill Butler, the U.S. European Command historian, also in Stuttgart, Germany.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and a hearty thank you to my fellow historians for joining us today. There's so much to say about D-Day and the events of 76 years ago. I hope our viewers will find the upcoming discussion of interest and perhaps learn something you didn't know before. As we get started, you may be asking, what makes D-Day commemoration so important? Why does it matter? One answer may simply be that because we always do it. And there's certainly some truth to that. In fact, we, as the American military in general, and I think to the very same extent our French and British friends, had set aside D-Day and the battlegrounds of Normandy as a special time and special place from the very beginning. The first anniversary of D-Day was marked on June 6, 1945, by a holiday for the Allied forces then undertaking their post-war occupation duties. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander for the D-Day operation and subsequent campaigns in Western Europe, sent out a message to the troops announcing the holiday and expressing his appreciation for their efforts. Later, for the 5th anniversary in 1949, a small memorial service was held on the shoreline, and American B-17 bombers conducted a flyover dropping flowers and firing off rockets. From that point, the ceremonies grew more elaborate. The larger anniversaries, 10th, 20th, 25th, 40th, 50th, and most recently the 75th last year, were occasions to honor the World War II veterans themselves and openly express our collective appreciation for their sacrifices. These were also times to bring together the leaders of the Allied nations to reflect on their shared history, and in some cases reconcile their differences over world events going on in their own times. The term Normandy Summit has been used frequently to describe how important these gatherings were. In that respect, we are continuing a tradition that has been well established and carries a lot of meaning. So what about the actual events before, during, and after D-Day itself? That's essentially what we are here to share with you today. I'll start from the top, so to speak. Known overall as Operation Overlord, the June 1944 assaults along the Normandy coastline represented the culmination of more than a year of intensive planning by Allied staffs. But even more than that, the chance to return to the continent and undertake the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi tyranny was something our British, French, and other European allies had been fervently wanting to do for much longer. In late 1943, American General Dwight Eisenhower was selected to serve as the overall commander for the forthcoming endeavor, and his team of multinational planners was known as the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF. Serving alongside him were a very experienced cadre of British leaders that helped to ensure that this would be a true coalition effort. Air Chief Marshal Tedder was his deputy commander. General Montgomery, with whom General Eisenhower had worked together in the Mediterranean, would serve as the initial land forces commander. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay would lead the Allied Expeditionary Naval Forces, and Air Chief Marshal Sir Lee Mallory commanded the Allied air effort. And as you'll soon hear from my fellow historians, these gentlemen, and many of their battle-tested subordinates, would be the guiding force for Overlord. Although it may be difficult to truly grasp the enormity of the task facing this team of leaders, I do hope you'll gain some small appreciation for what was involved. In a nutshell, their job was to get the U.S. 1st and British 2nd Armies of Montgomery's 21st Army Group across the English Channel. That force then was to execute a coordinated amphibious assault landing involving over 150,000 troops along a 60-mile front of beaches named Gold, Juneau, Sword, Omaha, and Utah. Of that 150,000, there were over 23,000 airborne soldiers whose job was to drop in on the western and eastern edges of the beachhead. Supporting this initial landing effort, the combined air and naval forces dedicated an armada of over 1 million personnel involving 6,900 naval vessels and 11,000 aircraft. I think you'll get an even better idea of how much was involved if you consider our small band of historians here, representing the efforts of thousands of service members from 12 allied nations. I think it's also important to acknowledge the vital contributions of the French resistance and French citizenry whose homeland was the battlefield. Without a doubt, the stakes were high, and failure could result in countless casualties and worse, an indefinite prolongation of the war and further delays in liberating Europe. I hope that's enough to set up the big picture, and I definitely look forward to the stories we are about to share with you. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Bill. Now I'd like to introduce Paul Beaver, an historian who joins us from England. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to join you today in this 76th anniversary of the D-Day operation. I'm speaking to you from southern England, just 25 miles from the English Channel coast. So it's something that I've grown up with all my life because I was born in this area. What I want to talk about is two vignettes about some operations that were carried out you may not have heard about before. But I think it's worth just adding to what we've heard already about how the organization went. To me, as a former soldier and as a pilot, it was an amazing operation to look back at when I was training to fly. One of the things that we all learnt about this was the ability of a coalition to work together. So it wasn't just British and American and just Canadian and just French. There were Dutchmen and Poles and Australians and New Zealanders. There were Norwegians and Danes. There were Belgians. All of these people had come together in a coalition of the willing. Perhaps the first time that we'd seen such a coalition work. And of course, we've never looked back. We are today always looking at these coalition operations because this is, in Normandy, what really started it. So the Airpower Operation, which you'll hear more about later, included obviously strategic bombing, Royal Air Force Bomber Command at night and the United States 8th Air Force during the day, and Tactical Air Force. The RAF Fighter Command was temporarily transformed into a Tactical Air Force along with the US 9th Air Force to create basically an organization that would allow Thunderbolts and Mustangs and Lightnings and Spitfires and especially the Typhoon tank buster to go into action to delay German reinforcements and to interdict all those lines of communication that the Germans had set up in occupied France. The Typhoon, I think, is especially worth thinking about because that's the aircraft that stopped German armoured formations from operating during daylight. They had to lager up during the day and come out only at night. That must in itself have saved thousands of Allied lives. But there are two things I think that are worth talking about. The first is the very first landing of anything, of anyone, on the night of the 5th of June, 1944, at Pegasus Bridge. If you've been to Pegasus Bridge and seen the museum, you would have seen the sights. You would have seen where the gliders landed. Now, to me as an army pilot, looking at the glider operation and thinking they were flown by sergeants, by non-commissioned officers, whose gliders were released at 6,000 feet, 2 miles out over the English Channel, and then flew in and landed with such pinpoint accuracy that they achieved surprise. This is what you want in a coup de main operation. The glider pilot regiment flying them was carrying the Ox and Bucks light infantry, and they assaulted Pegasus Bridge and captured it and held it until the commandos relieved them later in the day. This feat of flying was said by Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory to be the greatest feat of aviation of the Second World War. I don't think I would argue with that. It was tremendous. But we should also remember other great feats of aviation, and one of which I want to talk about now is the use of air observation posts. It was very clear to the Royal Artillery, the British gunners, that it was really important to get that third dimension, to get up in the air. They'd looked at working with fighter pilots to see if they could direct guns and found it was easier to teach a gunnery officer to fly than a pilot to spot for guns. There are 119 pilots were sent, British, Canadian and Polish airmen, flew the Taylorcraft Oster, a very light, flimsy little aircraft made of canvas and wood, unarmed, and it flew, well, the textbook said at 500 feet, and talking to veterans I realised they went down to 100 and sometimes to 30 feet to avoid anti-aircraft fire or enemy fighters. Of the 119 people who were there, only 7 died through enemy action. 3 more died because their own gunfire, their own shells, went through and destroyed their aircraft. Blue on blue happened in Normandy as it happens in every conflict. But these people were really quite remarkable. Again, these were soldiers flying, something which in Britain we hadn't had since 1918. The air observation post pilots today are forward air controllers who fly helicopters. We remember that legacy. I was privileged to be one of those forward air controllers in the Cold War. I always remembered the bravery and the valour of those people. And to me, what was particularly important was the way in which the Royal Air Force, who provided the ground crews, worked with the Army in order to make this happen. Coalition at a national level, but coalition also because we worked with the American and Canadian and Polish forces, so coalition on a much bigger scale. If we look back at D-Day and can learn anything from it, it must be that coalitions of the willing are the way to do things. A common cause is an amazing driver of professional capabilities. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you from England. I look forward to listening to the rest of this presentation from some eminent historians. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Paul. Next, I'd like to introduce Lise Pomoy, a military historian who joins us from France.
Hi. Wait a minute, I asked you. Okay, I'm a fighter, not a politician, and liberating France was a very complex political problem. If a country is liberated without the participation of its leaders, it's occupation and not liberation. But there was more than one French leader resisting the Nazi regime, and the most prominent one was de Gaulle, General de Gaulle. He was a prominent figure, advocating like Patton the use of tanks while the French army was still riding horses. But regular army officers preferred General Giraud, who escaped from captivity in April 1942 and worked with the Allies in secret and assumed command of the French troops in North Africa in November 1942. And they both represented the Free French forces at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. They were co-presidents of the French Committee of National Liberation, created by de Gaulle, but Giraud gave up, resigned, frustrated in April 1944. The committee was regarded as a political body, not a government. De Gaulle's ambition was to have his provisional government recognized, and Eisenhower was told to deal with the French military authorities as regards French forces, adding stress to the military preparations. Churchill insisted on June the 4th, it is very difficult to cut the French out of the liberation of France, and he was organizing a meeting between Roosevelt and de Gaulle. De Gaulle was flown from Algiers and was told to keep out of the way in the UK. The French participated in the preparations for D-Day as early as 1943, but with very small numbers. Our strength was intelligence and air force. 96 volunteer French soldiers formed the Sussex Squadron attached to the Royal Air Force. The plan had been conceived by American, British, and French secret intelligence organizations. In 1943, I worked in operation from April to September 1944. They worked in teams of two, an observer and his radio operator. Trained in England, they were parachuted in future battle zones north of the Loire Valley to determine the strength and disposition of the Panzer divisions and the location of V1 and V2 launch sites. Final report, results largely exceeding the most optimistic forecast. Now, there were also three French squadrons attached to the Royal Air Force, the Lorraine Bomb Squadron, who set up a smoke screen along the coast on D-Day, the Alsace Fighter Squadron with 41 victories and 27 enemy ships sank, Les Cigognes, and so on. At that conference, Roosevelt agreed to arm 8 infantry and 3 armored divisions for the French to be equipped by the US. The number was reduced to 5 infantry and 3 armored divisions committed for the Mediterranean theater. And no French forces were committed on D-Day except the 177 members of the Keeper Commando, who landed at 7:30 a.m. on South Beach before facing 75 years of oblivion. Last year, they were recognized by President Macron, who said they were almost nothing more than a symbol, but how powerful for France's honor. Philippe Kiefer, a banker of Alsatian origin raised in the US without any military background, had created an elite force who carried out raids across the Channel. They had trained in Scotland, and the British, being gentlemen, had let them land first. The gendarmes showed them the way to Ouistreham. They were greeted by the mayor of Colville and a young nurse, and other French women went to the beaches to help the wounded. Now, for their action at Rivabella, where they had 10 dead and 30 wounded, you have to see the longest day. They had had a key role in the D-Day landings as they cleared a path for the troops on the beach to meet up with British paratroopers who had landed further inland. Now, de Gaulle was furious because he hadn't been part of the landing, and for all the remaining years, he refused to meet with Keeper's forces. And the unit was disbanded in 1946, but reactivated in 2008. And they are the only French soldiers allowed to wear the green berets folded to the right in a British fashion. Now, besides that small representation of regular soldiers, there was an underground army of FFIs and civilians in the rear areas, risking their lives in sabotage. And the civilians who hadn't been evacuated had built fortifications for the third organization. They had erected anti-tank obstacles on the beaches, copied plans and maps of the coastal defenses and minefields, and their testimonies were invaluable. Their employers made the only mistake of underpaying them, and so the workers had no qualms about passing on information which was sent by pigeon to the SOE in London. So I can only quote two: a farmer who took his 9-year-old blind son around his field and described the work on the bunkers, and the boy memorized everything and told a resistance agent, and the information was transmitted to Britain with a transmitter hidden in a canned Campbell soup, which is now a museum piece. And there was the woman owner of a cafe in Bénouville who listened to the soldiers' conversation and passed the information on to the head of hospital and who was also the head of the local resistance. But resisting and doing these things was a lot more difficult for women, and they were often, when the war was over, accused of fraternization with the enemy, and it became very ugly for them. Now, D-Day was an incredible operation, and there's no doubt about that. But I think it was doomed from the start. The condition for success was to liberate Caen immediately on that same day. It was the key to the Seine River and the northeast. By passing Paris, Eisenhower would head towards the Ruhr area, cross the Rhine, and march to Berlin, the capital. And nobody spoke about the liberation of France. But it took Montgomery 78 days, 7,000 bombs, and the death of nearly 3,000 civilians to take Caen, during which time the Americans were lost in the hedgerows. And the original planning had to be abandoned almost 3 weeks after D-Day. Another factor which should have been taken into account was there were no infrastructures left due to sabotage. The intense bombing prior to D-Day, the storm of June the 19th, which had destroyed one of the 2 artificial ports, and the total destruction of Cherbourg, the only port, by the enemy. And the closest sizable one was Antwerp, still occupied. Divisions kept arriving. 1 million men on the 4th of July got their supplies from the beaches, which were exposed to German bombing. The campaign was already 44 days late and depending on gas abandoned by the Germans. Then the problem was made worse by the arrival of Leclerc and Patton with their 30 tanks, and production in the US stopped following. So the only solution was to revive an old plan established in 1943, the landing in Provence. If the 2 landings could have been simultaneous, the game would have been won. But the enemy would have been crushed between the Hammer, Overlord, and Antwerp. But it was impossible for lack of resources and Churchill's obstinate opposition. So he finally yielded 2 days before August the 15th, when the landing in Provence began. And this allowed the European campaign to go on with a different objective and more problems. Over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Lise. Paul had another virtual engagement, so he has left us, and we appreciate him briefly being able to join our discussion. And now I'd like to introduce Chris Rumley, the U.S. Air Forces in Europe Air Forces Africa Command historian.
Hi, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about the U.S. Army Air Forces and Allied Air Forces contributions to D-Day. Those contributions began months in advance as we worked. Can you hear me, Elizabeth? Those began months in advance as we worked to set the conditions that would allow for the invasion to even occur. And that included for the Air Force, and I'm going to use the term Air Force just for the sake of brevity on occasion. That contribution included gaining air superiority over the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and it also included especially gaining control of that area of the air over the beaches. And the second part of our mission was to isolate those beaches to protect the landing force by preventing the German reinforcements, those panzer units that were standing by, preventing them from aiding the defenders on the beach. So the story, our D-Day story begins in January of 1944. That's 5 months before the invasion. And that's when U.S. Army Air Force leaders resumed the bombing campaign against Germany, and they started sending these massive bomber formations into the heart of Germany. And some of the sizes of these formations were up to 1,000 bombers. During Big Week, the first week of Big Week, on day one, they sent 1,000 bombers that hit multiple targets. The difference between 1943, when we lost so many bombers, on this occasion, we sent fighter escorts with those bomber formations, and we sent anywhere from 600 to 700 on that first day. And that was a change in tactics that the Germans were not expecting either. And those fighter aircraft included the P-47 Delta, which is a newer version, a longer range, and the P-51 Mustang now, which was long range, highly maneuverable, and it was able to stay with those bombers along the entire route. So the bomber crews were hitting vital targets in Germany, the aircraft production targets. But most importantly, and their real mission on this day during Big Week was to lure the Luftwaffe into a fight. So those bombers were serving as bait, and they were successful. The Luftwaffe came to fight, and during the first week, or during that week of Big Week, February 1944, those fighter pilots and the bomber crews combined shot down or destroyed close to 300 enemy aircraft. It was difficult for the German Air Force to replace those aircraft, but they could. But what they couldn't replace was those well-trained and experienced pilots, and that really worked to our advantage. Now, as we got closer to D-Day, the Air Force leaders shifted targets, and they went after those Luftwaffe airfields in occupied France. And we bombed every airfield within 350 miles of the Normandy beaches. Additionally, the fighter escorts that were with those bombers, every fighter aircraft was also on a hunt and destroy mission. And that meant that those pilots were free to attack targets of opportunity. So, and that included enemy convoys in the open on the roads, troop concentrations. That included supply trains or trains carrying troops. If it dared move during daylight hours, it was a target. And in fact, we were so effective at this that the German forces and even some of their high command were complaining, and they were always asking, where is the Luftwaffe? To them, it seemed like every aircraft over their head was an American or British fighter or bomber about to attack their troops. And so what had happened is, rather than lose their Air Force and those valuable pilots in France, the Luftwaffe had withdrawn their Air Force closer to Germany and saved them to fight another day. Now, for the second part of our mission, to isolate those beaches from the German reinforcements, that was essentially a bombing campaign, and we went after the major rail centers in France, Belgium, and Western Germany especially, to prevent those fresh reinforcements from making it into France, and to prevent supplies from easily making it into France. At the same time we were doing that, we went after hundreds of bridges and bombed those bridges that were leading towards Normandy. And that was to prevent or frustrate those German panzer units from getting to the beaches to help the defenders once we landed. So now on D-Day itself, Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties, and that included close to 1,000 U.S. troop carrier planes and gliders that dropped those 17,000 paratroops, close to 17,000 paratroops into enemy-held territory to hold key positions. Our British comrades dropped another set of paratroops, close to 7,000. Pilots also flew sorties, protecting that naval convoy that was coming across the English Channel. We provided close air support to the troops on the ground, and we continued to fly those hunt and destroy missions, moving out forward from the beaches. And then lastly, we preceded the invasion with a huge bomb run over the beach defenses. So by comparison to the Allied Air Force's 14,000 sorties on D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew 319 sorties. So we had control of the air, and on the ground, very few reinforcements made it to help the defenders. Before a shot was ever fired on D-Day, Allied fighters and bombers destroyed over 5,000 enemy aircraft. Now we know the difficult time that the invasion force had taking those beaches, especially on Omaha Beach. But now imagine if any number of those 5,000 enemy aircraft had been available to attack the ships coming across the English Channel, or to strafe or bomb those troops that were coming onto the beaches. It could have proved fatal to the attack. And I'll conclude with this. I don't mean to make it sound like the Luftwaffe was a pushover. They certainly were not. They had been winning in Europe essentially since 1939. In the 5 months leading to D-Day, Allied air forces lost over 2,000 planes and nearly 12,000 men in the air war. And you have to remember that every bomber that went down had 10 men on board with it. And the other bombers in the formation would see these planes go down. And yet, every day, day after day, they would climb back into those aircraft and go on those missions again, knowing that it might cost them their lives. And they did it because they know the missions might also save someone's life on the invasion beaches. And that's why they did what they did. And that bravery and that courage, that dedication to the mission is part of our Air Force heritage. And that's what we remember each year, and it's what we commemorate each year on D-Day. And I thank you for the time, Elizabeth, and with that, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you, Chris. And the airman in me just has to say air power. By the way, Chris joins us from Ramstein Air Base, Germany. At this time, I'd like to introduce Chris Havern, the U.S. Navy historian, who joins us from Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and I appreciate the opportunity to join with these other eminent historians to discuss the operations for Operation Overlord and to represent the Naval History and Heritage Command. The codenamed, as Bill mentioned earlier, the naval operations were codenamed Neptune, and they were for the naval operations for Operation Overlord would be the largest amphibious assault ever attempted. And again, as Bill mentioned, British Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay was designated the Commander-in-Chief for Allied Naval Forces. Subordinate to him, however, was Rear Admiral Alan G. Kirk, who was commander of Task Force 122, which was the U.S. or the Western Naval Task Force. His command was divided into two amphibious assault forces. Force U attacking Utah Beach under Rear Admiral Don P. Moon, and Force O attacking Omaha Beach under Rear Admiral John L. Hall. Naval gunfire support for Task Force 122 is to be provided by 3 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers, and 1 monitor from the U.S., British, Free French, and Dutch navies. Rear Admiral Morton L. Deo's Bombardment Force A was to support the landings on Utah, while Rear Admiral Carlton F. Bryant's Bombardment Force C supported those on Omaha. Landing area obstacles were to be cleared by Naval Combat Demolition Units. These were combined with U.S. Army Combat Engineers into Gap Assault Teams, or GATs, that were to detonate mines at the waterline and clear obstacles on the beaches in order to clear 50-yard gaps in the German defenses for exploitation by the assault troops. H-hour for the U.S. landings was set for 0630, which was an hour before the British and Canadian landings on Gold, Juno, and Sword. In advance of the 6 June assault, U.S. troops and equipment loaded into their attack transports, LSTs, and LCIs at the embarkation ports along England's southern coast. Earlier, the gunfire support ships had departed their anchorages off Northern Ireland and Scotland. Once underway, All these ships steamed for the mid-channel rendezvous point designated Area Zebra, or Piccadilly Circus, for the final drive into the beaches. Having reached the firing line, and while it was still dark, the gunfire support ships commenced their bombardments at 0536. The units of General Omar Bradley's U.S. First Army had loaded into their landing craft and were moving toward their assigned beaches as the shelling commenced. As the approaching dawn enabled the observation of fires, the cruisers shifted to pre-assigned targets on the bluffs above the beach, while the battleships used aerial spotting to fire farther inland to support the U.S. Airborne Divisions dropped behind Utah. The ships, however, did not target the beaches for fear of cratering the landing areas and inhibiting the movement of vehicles once they landed. While U.S. troops with U.S. troops scheduled to land at 0630, Utah and Omaha received just over 40 minutes of naval bombardment before the assault troops began coming ashore. The first GATs began their demolition work at 0633, which was H plus 3 minutes. Soon, successive waves of assault troops came ashore. However, heavy German mortar and machine gun fire pinned them down and stalled their advance onto the bluffs above, and thus preventing them from achieving their objectives further inland. Though intended to screen the invasion fleet from German U-boats and the small, fast E-boats, which were similar to RPT boats, the accompanying destroyers soon responded to the emerging crisis ashore. Closing to within 400 yards, many provided direct fire support. In fact, historian Craig Simons asserted what saved the day for the Allies was a handful of British and American destroyers. Examples of the intensity of this effort include the destroyer Carmack firing 1,127 of her 1,500 5-inch shells in less than an hour, and the indirect fires of the destroyers Satterley, Ellison, and Thompson in the support of the 2nd Ranger Battalion's ascent of Pontoohook. The bombardment groups continued to provide naval gunfire support to the units ashore during the succeeding weeks. The foremost of these operations occurred on the 22nd of June when Rear Admiral Deo's Task Force 129 supported the Allied advance on Cherbourg. Battle Group 1 under Deo's command consisted of the battleship Nevada, along with 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers, and was assigned to bombard Cherbourg's inner harbor forts in the area west of the port. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Bryant's smaller battle group, which consisted of the battleships Texas and Arkansas and 5 destroyers, was assigned Battery Hamburg, which was a German fortification located 6 miles east of the port. Though these forces came under well-placed and heavy German counter-battery fire, they successfully suppressed their targets, and the port ultimately fell on the 26th of June. British military historian Corelli Barnett described Operation Neptune as a never-surpassed masterpiece of planning and staff work. This was certainly true, but it was also the bravery and flexibility of those who executed these plans that ensured the success of these operations, which demonstrated the height of the Allies' strength in cooperating to achieve the common goal of liberating France and Western Europe and defeating Hitler's Germany. Thank you again, Elizabeth, for giving us the opportunity to be here today, and back to you.
Thank you, Chris. Now I'd like to introduce Scott Price, the Chief Historian for the U.S. Coast Guard, who joins us from Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to extend my thanks to the U.S. European Command for once again hosting a wonderful event, and I'm honored to have been included with this wonderful group of historians, and we do appreciate it. And the fact that you remember D-Day every year is a wonderful thing to do, so thank you. I'd like to talk briefly about what the Coast Guard did because we were at Normandy. By 1944, the Coast Guard was quite used to working with Navy, Army, and Allied forces in combat. In fact, we'd been involved in every amphibious operation since Tulagi and Guadalcanal, where Coast Guardsmen landed Marine Corps personnel at the first invasion, and we've been there ever since through all the other invasions. By 44, we participated in every major Allied assault in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters in concert with our fellow armed services and our allies. We were expert small boat handlers, which had been recognized early on, and we were also excellent ocean-going seamen. We were there in the convoy battles that set up everything we needed to have in England for this invasion. So the North Atlantic convoy battles that set up the whole thing, we were there too, along with our Navy colleagues. The Coast Guard provided crews to a number and variety of Navy transports, including APs, LSTs, and LCIs. If you study naval history and our military history long enough, you're going to get lots of acronyms. APs were the large assault transports. They were basically large passenger vessels. LSTs, I think a lot of folks are familiar with, and LCIs, which were landing craft infantry. The total number of Coast Guard and Coast Guard manned vessels approached 100 on 6 June. The LSTs were fairly equally divided between the various beaches, including supporting our allies on Gold, Juno, and Sword. Coast Guard LCVPs from the Coast Guard APs landed on the beaches under fire with the initial assault waves after the UDT teams did their work at 06:30 that morning. Now, LCVPs are basically the journeyman vehicles, vessels that they use to get troops from the assault transports to the beaches in the initial assaults. And I'm not sure if all of you seen the photo of Into the Jaws of Death. This is Omaha Beach, and it was taken by a Coast Guard combat photographer on Omaha Beach at 0740 local time. And that was taken by Chief Photographer's Mate Robert Sargent. And that's Omaha Beach at 740. So you can see the bluffs in the background, but that's an LCVP there in the front. So if anybody's seen Saving Private Ryan in the initial scenes that Steven Spielberg so brilliantly filmed, those are LCVPs. They're open. You had spray coming in. The assault transports were about 10 miles offshore. This was in the dark. They had 36 troops on board, crews of 3, and 10 miles through choppy English Channel waters with the spray coming in, the darkness. You can just imagine what that was like. The major players for the Coast Guard were 3 large attack transports, and these included the USS Bayfield, under the command of Captain Lyndon Spencer, that served as Rear Admiral Moon's flagship off Utah Beach that Chris Hayward mentioned earlier. The Samuel Chase was under the command of Coast Guard Captain Edward Fritch, and that served off Omaha Beach. Now, Captain Fritch was assigned as the assault commander of Assault Group 01 and landed troops on Easy Red and Fox Green beaches. The Joseph Dickman was also at the Omaha beaches. Following behind the LCVPs, they made the initial landings and then would go back 10 miles to the transports, pick up another load of troops, bring them back in, and they were doing that all morning. After that came the LCIs, the landing craft infantry that I mentioned earlier. This included Coast Guard LCI Flotilla 10, which was under the able command of Coast Guard Captain Miles Imlay, one of our unsung heroes of that day. They had originally participated in the landings at Sicily and Italy, and then they sailed to the UK in December, and they were based out of Agatha Christie's estate on the Dart River from December on, where they trained for the Normandy landings. And that flotilla consisted of 30 LCIs. 24 were entirely Coast Guard manned, and 6 were Navy. Now, the LCIs, the nickname that the troops that sailed on them called them was Lousy Civilian Idea. They were considered seaworthy, but I don't think I'd want to go open ocean sailing on them. They were flat bottoms, so they rolled and pitched like crazy, about 158 feet in length. But they were designed to land directly on the beaches and then have 2 landing ramps on either side of the bow that were pulled off once the craft landed. And troops were able to go off each ramp, and they could carry 200 at a time. Now that day, June 6th, the Coast Guard lost 4, 3 directly on Omaha Beach. And they were burning all day long. And so the smoke columns that came off the wrecks were used as navigational beacons for incoming vessels and craft that day. It was the greatest number of combat losses the Coast Guard had ever in a single day. Now, another large part of the Coast Guard operations there were 60 cutters that were brought over from the United States to provide search and rescue services. That's the heart and soul of our service, is saving lives. And we were there with 60 cutters. They were 83-footers, and they were made of wood with gasoline engines. So, as with any servicemen, you always tend to make nicknames of your craft. And this was called the Matchbox Fleet. But we had half sailing with the Americans and half sailing with the British and Canadians. And they went in right behind the LCIs, and they were right off the beaches within hundreds of yards, pulling folks out of the water. On D-Day alone, they pulled over 400 soldiers out of the water. And by the end of their service, later in 1944, they'd rescued almost 1,500 people. Miles Imlay, I mentioned him earlier, I think was probably the most deserving coastie who served on D-Day, did not get the attention he deserved. He commanded the LCIL flotilla that I mentioned. It landed troops on both Omaha and Utah beaches while concurrently serving as the Deputy Assault Commander of Assault Group 01. And he spent the entire day of June 6th off the beaches. He was directing the offload of assault troops to the Omaha beaches, then started directing cargo coming into the beaches in communications with the appropriate beach masters. And so he would find out what cargo was on what LST and then would assign it which part of the beach it needed to get to. And once Captain Fritsch departed that day, he took over as assault commander. Now, interesting enough, later on, he served as the captain of the port, as we call them, but the port director for the Mulberry Harbor that was built off Omaha Beach until it was destroyed by a storm later in June. That's the key to what happens after the assault for the naval forces. Being the logistics support for the troops ashore, getting them what they need, reinforcements and supplies. Now that storm that I mentioned led the effort to capture and clear and open Cherbourg in even greater importance. An effort to liberate France depended on having steady supplies brought to the front, as I noted. Here, Coast Guard Captain Quentin Wallace played an interesting role in liberating that city after first being assigned to Chafe. It was he that developed plans to utilize the French ports before being sent to Normandy himself. And there he participated in the liberation of Cherbourg later in June. And using guile and bluff, he got hundreds of German defenders to surrender without firing a single shot. His heroism was recognized at the time by the award of a Navy Cross, only one of 6 awarded to coasties in the entire war. And most recently, the United States Navy gave him the honor of naming the DDG after him. And you always have to talk about the cost of that day. The Coast Guard lost 15 killed in action on 6 June, and most of those were on Omaha Beach. And 6 of those Coast Guardsmen still rest in French soil in the U.S. cemetery at Normandy. Coast Guardsmen earned 1 Navy Cross, 11 Silver Stars, and 1 British Distinguished Service Cross on D-Day. It was a bloody day that led directly to the liberation of France and Western Europe, and so their sacrifice was not in vain and must always be remembered by those who value freedom. So thank you for this, and in closing I'll say, Semper Paratus. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Scott. Next, I'd like to introduce Peter Knight, historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History, also joining us from Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to my fellow historians. It's a pleasure to be a part of this commemoration event and to be able to talk about the United States Army's role in D-Day. I'll begin with Army training prior to the invasion conducted in the United Kingdom. If we think about the United Kingdom as that unsinkable aircraft carrier, that training platform, the platform from which this massive undertaking will be launched, it's important to talk about the American units there that had varying timelines and amounts of time to be able to prepare for the invasion. Of the divisions that will land on Utah and Omaha beaches on D-Day, the 29th Infantry Division will have the most time in the United Kingdom, comprised of units largely from the Virginia and Maryland areas, the blue and the gray division, if you will, to include the Stonewall Brigade that has its lineage going back to pre-Civil War days. This unit had a year plus to get ready for the invasion. The 1st Infantry Division was the most seasoned of the Army's divisions, and they had previous landing experience both in North Africa as part of Operation Torch, and then in Sicily as part of Operation Husky. And so General Bradley thought it was quite important to bring that very experienced division to be part of the Normandy operation. The 4th Infantry Division under Raymond Tubby Barton would train together in the United States for a considerable amount of time, but would only arrive in the UK with 4 months left to train and prepare for the actual invasion operation. Don't forget that there are also airborne paratrooper divisions involved here, 2 of them, the 82nd and the 101st. And these were relatively new to the U.S. Army, developed in response to the Germans having that capability and demonstrating it with great deftness in the Mediterranean theater of operations. So U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall said, I want paratroopers. And so they stood up these units. The 82nd is the more experienced of the two divisions. They actually took part in airborne landings in Sicily and in Italy as part of the operations there, Operation Avalanche, landing at Salerno and Anzio. So Matthew B. Ridgway's division will have a lot of experience coming into the Normandy operation. And then there is the 101st Airborne Division that was originally led by Major General William C. Lee, coming together in the United States and training. But then when they arrive in September of 1943 to the UK, Major General Lee suffers some heart problems and has to relinquish command. And so they choose Maxwell Taylor, who is the commander of the 82nd Division's artillery, to lead the division into Normandy. These divisions will take part in numerous combined joint exercises of increasing intensity over the intervening months prior to the invasion. And they will graduate from using blank ammunition to using live ammunition to incorporating naval gunfire to landing the paratroops behind the landing area at the same time. These are all necessary and complex training missions that they had to undertake to prepare for the rigors of what they would endure on D-Day. As a result of that very realistic and dangerous training, we will actually lose more American soldiers in that training than we will lose on D-Day itself. And yet, we had to train, we had to prepare to be ready for this. Some of our other units, the Ranger Battalions, under Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, who would have some of the more sensitive missions to take out an artillery battery on the Point du Hoc. They will train in the Scottish Highlands at a place known as Auchencarry Castle. There they will be able to escape the prying eyes of German reconnaissance planes since they can't fly that far over the UK. So they were able to train in relative secrecy alongside British commandos. So they were busy preparing there in all parts of the United Kingdom. There were some lessons that informed that training and the planning for Operation Overlord that came out of the Mediterranean theater. Air superiority, of course, was essential, as my colleague Chris Rumley has mentioned. Absolutely essential to protect the landing craft because they'd be sitting ducks for dive bombing or torpedo planes that could wreak havoc on the landing. Mine sweeping in advance of the landing craft was a must to be able to clear those sea lanes and give them a fighting chance of getting ashore. The Anzio landing itself was a big elephant in the room for Operation Overlord planning, and that was because Major General Lucas, who led that landing, while he got his units ashore relatively quickly, he hesitated. He did not necessarily press the advantage perhaps as well as he could have, as he waited to consolidate more of his forces ashore. And while that caution is, in the eyes of many, a prudent caution, it also runs the risk of allowing the Germans to repel that amphibious assault and knock it back into the sea. And so the lessons of Anzio were definitely in the back of General Collins' mind, the 7th Corps commander, and that of General Giroux, the 5th Corps commander, as well as General Bradley, the Army Group commander. So those lessons would carry forward in the training. For the landings at Utah and Omaha, understand that we're talking about the 7th Corps under General J. Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe Collins, who had formerly commanded the 25th Infantry Division in the Pacific Theater and was brought to Europe because of his tenacity and ability as a commander. And then Leonard Giroux will command the 5th Corps. Together, that's about 74,000 men, approximately 17,000 of which are airborne and glider infantry troops that will all take part in the attack. The airborne contingent is part of the 7th Corps attack for facilitating the landings at Utah Beach. And so for the airborne divisions, their objectives on D-Day are absolutely essential to facilitate that particular landing. For the 82nd Division, they will have the mission of securing key road junctions in the city of San Mariglis, which sits astride the N13 highway, which is the main north-south artery of the Cotentin Peninsula. Being able to control that roadway will afford General Collins's troops the ability to attack Cherbourg from the landward side. They will also have the mission of securing key river crossing points at the Lafayette and Chef du Pont bridge areas over the Merdere River to the west of Saint-Mary-Église. The idea being here to control those bridges and be able to protect the landing force against any possible German counterattack by panzer divisions or other German elements, German paratroopers and the like. And then the 101st Division under Maxwell Taylor will have some significant objectives as well. Their mission will be to secure the several causeways that lead off of Utah Beach, the only available exits, because the Germans had flooded and inundated the marshlands in the low-lying areas just beyond the beaches. They do that, of course, to deter any possible amphibious landing, and it would force the landing forces to canalize into those different causeways, those only available exits, which could then be easily defended if they are not taken. So the 101st is absolutely critical to the success here. They have to secure those causeways to afford the 4th Division the ability to exit off of the landing beach. So that in a nutshell are the airborne missions for D-Day. And also one last thing for the 101st, they also have to control the lock in the area, the La Barquette lock that controls the level of water in that inundated area. So those are their missions for D-Day. Let's talk about Utah Beach and how that landing goes. The 4th Infantry Division ends up landing south of its intended landing area, just a little bit further south on Utah Beach on the Cotentin Peninsula. This is because of the currents prevailing in the channel at the time, and also the fact that a couple of their guide boat landing craft had been taken out, and so they didn't have that left and right markers, if you will, that's guiding them in from the larger landing craft. And so they're going to end up landing to the south, which actually works to their advantage. It's that area of the beach is not as heavily defended as where they were going to land. So this actually works to their advantage. And there are concrete resistance nests that are essentially a mile apart, all down the beach. But in this particular area, they're able to land enough troops. They're still going to take artillery fire from some batteries that are located inland that have ranges anywhere from 6 to 7 miles to as many as 20 miles. And those guns are going to take out some of the landing craft, going to take out the cruiser USS Corey. So they're going to have to deal with those. And naval gunfire is going to help silence some of those guns. But it's not going to be for another 48 hours until the landing forces actually go and take out the rest of those batteries. But don't forget the paratroopers are back there. The 101st is wreaking havoc, and so is the 82nd. Although their landings were dispersed because of flak fires and poor weather, and they're spread all over the place, these paratroopers know to adapt and improvise and overcome. They're going to band together in small groups, and they're going to do a lot to disrupt the Germans, confuse the Germans. The Germans are trying to figure out where is the troop concentration, what are they here to do? And so that confusion works to our advantage as well. The airborne troops are going to take out artillery units in their barracks areas. They're going to help take out some of these batteries. Small unit actions led by men like Major Dick Winters, who was a first lieutenant at that time. But he was leading the Easy Company of the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment. He takes an 11-man element and takes out a battery of guns at Brecourt Manor. And those guns were aimed specifically on the number 2 causeway, the number 2 exit at La Madeleine, leading off of Utah Beach. By virtue of silencing that battery, Winters and his element played a crucial function in enabling the heavy elements, the tanks, as well as the infantry to move off of Utah Beach. We can't forget the contributions of Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt, who landed with the first wave, voluntarily landed with the first wave, because he wanted to steady the men as they moved ashore, and he knew that his presence there would enable them to do that. When he got on the beach, he realized he had landed in the wrong place, but he said, "We're going to start the war from right here." He knew that it would be more confusing to try to stick to the original plan, and so he's going with the flow here to get everybody ashore as soon as possible. Actions like that between the airborne troops and the leadership of men like General Roosevelt get the job done on Utah Beach. Let's shift now over to Omaha Beach, where the terrain is much more difficult. Large bluffs that dominate the length of the beach, and the Germans, of course, have made their defenses appropriate to the terrain. There are a series of draws that are the only exits off of Omaha Beach, and the Germans have those covered with machine guns, 88 millimeter anti-armor guns, and mortars that are sighted to turn the beach into a killing ground and to cover those draws and prevent any ingress off of the beaches. Allow me to share with you the experience of the 29th Infantry Division and one of their soldiers in their initial wave ashore on Omaha Beach. Harold Baumgarten was a private in Bravo Company of the 116th Infantry Regiment. He was on the second wave ashore at Omaha at 0700 on D-Day. And he recalls his experience upon leaving his landing craft. He said, and I quote, "Now there are only two of us left alive from my boat team, Charles Connor and myself. We had 85% casualties in the first 15 minutes. I started cursing that machine gun that was on the right flank. I never used foul language, but I had to curse him because he was killing all the guys around me. A fellow named Nicholas Kapkalis was next to me when he was cut in half. I saw the machine gunner up there by the glare, the shade of his helmet. So I took my rifle. I was a super expert, and that rifle fired. I shot at him. No more firing from that machine gun. I was cursing that pillbox on the right flank, and a shell went off in front of me, 88 millimeter. It blew off my left cheek, gave me a hole in the roof of my mouth, and I had teeth and gums lying on my tongue. Left upper jaw was shot away, and my cheek was flapping over my ear. And I looked to my left front, and Bedford Hoback of Bedford, Virginia, got hit with the same shell right in the face. He was dead. Next to him was a fellow named Elmer Wright of Bedford, Virginia. He was already dead. I figured I'd better get off the beach. It seems with an experience like that, you would think it's impossible for any of these men to make it off the beach. But what gets it done on Omaha Beach that day are, again, small unit actions by key leaders. Men like Company Commander Ralph Granson, Charlie Company, 2nd Ranger Battalion. They will land in the wrong place, as many of them did that day, but they will improvise. And instead of going after his original objective, a resistance nest atop an adjacent terrain feature, he will go from where he lands and assault a different German resistance position atop the westernmost bluff adjacent to the Beerville Draw. And by virtue of doing that and succeeding in taking that position, it forces the Germans to divert their attention away from the draw. On the opposite side, on the eastern side, General Norm Cota, the Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Division, will lead similar assault-type missions up the bluffs in an area between the draws where the defense wasn't quite as dense. And they're able to use Bangalore torpedoes, among other methods, to get up onto the bluffs and then attack German resistance nest from behind. So they, too, will produce a similar effect on the opposite side of the Beerville Draw. And eventually, they will be able to overwhelm those positions and open up the draw and allow the troops to move inland. General Bradley, who's on the USS Augusta watching everything unfold from the sea, is very worried because the initial landings weren't going well. Guys like Baumgartner and his elements, 4 companies worth of the 29th Division, are decimated in the first 90 minutes of the landing. But after that, we begin to see these small unit actions take root and have success. And that, in combination with the naval gunfire from the cruisers and destroyers that are moving closer into the beach, are what's going to make everything succeed on Omaha Beach. Don't forget the Ranger battalions. I already mentioned Ralph Granson, but don't forget Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder and his crew that's scaling up the cliffs of the Pointe du Hoc, silence a battery of 155 millimeter guns that can range out to 12 miles against the Allied fleet. It could also range to Omaha or Utah beaches, which was why those guns had to be silenced. And while Rudder had some intelligence that those guns might have been moved, couldn't afford to take the chance that they weren't there or they weren't going to be put into operation. So they scaled the cliffs. He had 225 men take part in that mission. By the time they made it to the top relatively quickly, in as little as 30 minutes. But the longer fight came in trying to hold their position against German counterattacks, all the while finding the battery where it had been relocated in a field about a mile south, disabling the guns and setting up a roadblock along the lateral road that ran behind the Pointe du Hoc and await reinforcements from Omaha Beach. They accomplished their mission, but they did so at tremendous cost. Only 90 of those 225 men were left when reinforcements finally reached them, and most of them were wounded. But again, small unit leadership gets the job done at both Omaha and Utah beaches. Let's talk a little bit about what happens afterwards. What's critical now that Utah and Omaha have been taken is to unify the beachheads. The crossroads town of Carentan is the location where those two beachheads would logically come together. Naturally, the Germans know this, and they want to have the flexibility to attack into the flanks of either of those landing beach areas. And so they will defend Carentan to the last. But the 101st gets the mission to take out Carentan, and they will move by way of the N13 highway from the north with the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, and they will be in a nasty fight along what is known as Purple Heart Lane, trying to traverse over the River Douve in a series of 3 bridges to get into Carentan itself. It will be a long, hard fight. Robert Cole, 3rd Battalion Commander of the 502nd, will distinguish himself by leading a bayonet charge that will allow 502nd to finally get a foothold into the town of Carentan and facilitate the rest of the division to envelop the town. By the 12th of June, Carentan falls to the Americans, and they're able to link up those two beachheads. This leaves General Collins the flexibility now to move his 4th Division and the follow-on 90th Division to the north to take the port of Cherbourg. They're gonna be among the first to encounter the Bocage territory of Normandy, which is a very nasty terrain that has huge embankments running from 8 to 13 feet in height, made of tree roots and earth that are just impossible to get through. And there are a maze of these fields, and they only have certain exits. And the Germans have learned how to cover those with both direct and indirect fire, turning every one of those hedgerows into a killing field, making it painful to take in every inch of ground in that area. So as they move towards Cherbourg, they're going to experience that. Cherbourg will fall by the end of June, and then the next objective will be the town of Saint-Lô to the south of Carentan. And they'll have to go through more hedgerow country to get there. Between 7 and 20 July, the 30th Division and 9th Divisions will each take about 3,000 casualties trying to break through that Bocage country. How do they do this? They pair their infantry and armor units together to try to take out the heavy weaponry of the Germans and the light infantry that protects it. But to get through the hedgerows, they have an innovation. They take the beach obstacles, the tetrahedrons that are on the beaches, and they weld them to the front of the tanks and turn these tanks into what they call rhino tanks that they're able to drive and bust through the hedgerows and set the conditions they want to set within those areas. And that is what enables them to get through the hedgerows to the town of Saint-Lô. So that's what enables them to set the conditions to finally break out of the hedgerow country once Saint-Lô falls. And that's when you'll start to see General Patton's 3rd Army come in an operation known as Cobra, that would be the breakout from the Normandy beachhead. That, in a nutshell, is how things progress from D-Day moving in. And we must never forget the tremendous cost that our forces pay, both there on D-Day itself, where you have anywhere from essentially 3,000 wounded and 1,500 KIA on D-Day alone. And then, within a day of that, that's going to go up to 1,800 KIA and 4,400 wounded and 2,000 missing. And that's before we even get into the casualties of the hedgerows, which are much more severe. So we must never forget what it took to get all of that accomplished. And with that, Elizabeth, back to you.
Thank you, Peter. And now, rounding out this all-star lineup of historians, I'd like to introduce Giles Milton, a British historian who also joins us from France.
Hi, thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'd like to build on a bit of what Peter touched on in his talk there, which was what it was really like for the ordinary soldiers on D-Day, the young conscripts, the teenagers who landed in the opening waves on that day, 6th of June, 1944. Because so much that's been written about D-Day was in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, was written by the officer class. They were the ones that could get their accounts published. And they present D-Day as an immaculately planned operation, as indeed it was, but one that went entirely to plan, which of course it didn't. Because when you read the private diaries, the letters, the oral interviews of those young lads who went in the opening waves, a very, very different story begins to emerge. It's a story of a small number of individuals who perform truly heroic actions that save the day on all of the five landing beaches. It's a story of absolute fear, of young men who are terrified of dying. It's a story of physical hardship and also of comradeship. These were men that, don't forget, they've been training together for months. They really were bands of brothers. They cared for one another deeply. So let's meet one of them, Cliff Morris. He's a young British commando, and he's going to land on Sword Beach, which is the most easterly of the 5 landing beaches. He kept a handwritten diary. He wrote it every single day, and it's an unvarnished account of what it was really like to land that day. Now, on the night before, he was in Portsmouth Harbour, and there was a bit of a party going on in the afternoon, something of a carnival atmosphere, lots of bravado. Everyone was in a good mood. He says, and I quote, "Everyone was on deck laughing and shouting, and the radio was playing away with swing music. What a feeling! I never loved England so truly as that moment." But everything changed a few hours later when they put to sea. Morris was aboard a small, shallow draft boat. It was LCT 506, and it was twisting and bucking in the ferocious seas that night. It was the worst weather in the Channel for 20, 30, 40 years. Instead of just tossing and rolling about, he said, our vessel was being lifted clean out of the water and landing back with a dull thud that shook every beam and threw all its occupants from one side to the other. Shortly before leaving England, he'd eaten a huge bowl of greasy meat stew, tons of chocolate, and pints of strong English tea. And he was, of course, violently sick, as were all his comrades on board, and some of them so bad they were pretty much out cold. Now, these are the men who are about to tackle Hitler's war machine on the coast of Normandy. The commandos didn't go in the first wave on Sword Beach. They came in after the East Yorks, and as they approached the shore, Cliff Morris was horrified by what he saw. Listen to this. He says, there were bodies sprawled all over the beach, some with their legs, arms and heads missing, the blood clotting in the sand. The moans and screams of those in agony blended with the shriek of bullets and the winding of shells. Now, Cliff Morris, as I said, he was one of the commandos, and the commandos were the elite of the British Army, and their landing was to be made famous by the Hollywood movie The Longest Day. It became so famous, they became so famous in part because of the leader of the commandos, the 15th Lord Lovett, a flamboyant Scottish aristocrat who came with a colourful background. He was a showman, and this was revealed when he landed on Sword Beach with his Highland bagpiper with him playing music, and he was carrying his Scottish hunting rifle and wearing a shirt monogrammed with his family crest. His mission and the mission of the commandos that day was absolutely vital for the success of D-Day. They were to link up with John Howard's men, who'd landed, as Paul told us earlier, landed by glider during the night and captured 2 vital bridges, Pegasus Bridge and Ranville Bridge. Now, unless the commandos reached these beleaguered men and held those bridges for the rest of the day, Operation Overlord was in potentially deep trouble. Because if the Germans recaptured those bridges, they could sweep their panzer divisions back towards the coast and drive the Allies back into the sea. Now, the official version of what happened with the commandos goes like this. Lord Lovett and his men land on Sword Beach in a blaze of gunfire. They slice through the enemy defences, as Lovett put it, like a knife through butter. And then they charged across the countryside with Lovett always leading from the front, and they reach the glider forces at Pegasus Bridge, and Lovett strides forward, shakes John Howard by the hand and says, "Sorry, old boy, we are 2 minutes late." It's a fabulous story. It's one that was adopted in its entirety for the film The Longest Day. And who was the consultant for that film? None other than Lord Lovett himself. A very different story emerges when you speak to the young lads and you hear their stories. In particular, I'd like to look at very briefly at the story of Stan Scotty Scott, who says it wasn't like this at all. He was a tough pub fighter from London, from North London. He loved a bit of a fight, and he also liked to win. And he was determined that day that he and his band of men, 3 troops, 6 commando, were going to win the race to the bridge. They successfully landed on Sword. They assembled their folding bicycles that they had, the commanders had, and they rushed inland to try and get to Pegasus Bridge first. They were always under enemy fire the whole way, and he gives a vivid impression of what it was like. Rounds hitting from all sides. There was rounds ricocheting off and splatting and hitting. Campbell was just the unlucky one. He got clobbered. He got hit through the neck, fell down in one big lump. Him, the bike, and all that. Well, Stan Scotty Scott's account of his arrival at the bridge stands in stark contrast to that of Lord Lovett. There were no bagpipes. There were no apologies, old boy, for being 2 minutes late. A lone paratrooper, wounded, looked up at him, and I will moderate my language. He says, "Where the F have you been?" Which I think rings somehow true of what it was really like. And Stan Scotty Scott felt aggrieved for the rest of his life that the heroic efforts of him and his men had been written out of the history books. He said that when we arrived at Pegasus Bridge, there was none of the bagpipe playing and cheering and all of that crap. He won the race to the bridge, and his story was just one of many individual acts of courage that was repeated up and down the coastline that day. And as Peter Knight said, on Utah, on Omaha, Juneau, Gold and Sword, there were men who fought with extreme bravery. One of them was the Cliff Morris, who I mentioned at the beginning. He fought for 12 hours solid that day before collapsing into a foxhole, totally exhausted by the end of the day. And so I think that now, 76 years after Operation Overlord, with very few of these heroic men still with us, it's time to recognise their achievements and the achievements of young heroes like Cliff Morris, Stan Scott, and his men of 3 Troop, 6 Commando. And with that, Elizabeth, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Giles. In closing, I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your time, and for giving voice to the bravery, the heroism, and the strength of alliance that defines D-Day. Even in the midst of a global pandemic, together we remember the historic operation that proved to be the tipping point for World War II in Europe. From Headquarters, U.S. European Command, I'm Elizabeth Ortiz signing off. Thank you.